Transhumanism is like a movement organized in 1900 that it says, we want to travel fast. It's okay. Do you want trains or automobiles or planes? Because these are all possibilities. It's like, no, we just want to move fast. It's like, okay, well, do you want seat belts, electric cars, or gasoline cars? No, fast. We want fast. It's like, that's not enough. You need to tell us a little bit more about the kind of future that you want. And that's where we're at with transhumanism.
Le podcast
Humain demain.
Salut à tous chers abonnés, ici Gaëtan de The Flares et on se retrouve pour la série de podcasts Humain demain en collaboration avec l'AFT, l'association française transhumaniste. Dans cet épisode, nous recevons James Hughes. Il est sociologiste américain et directeur de l'Institut pour l'éthique des technologies émergentes. Je vais laisser Marc Roux l'introduire plus en détail.
Alors, disons-le tout de suite, pour l'AFT Techno-prog, James Hughes n'est pas tout à fait n'importe quel transhumaniste. Le fait que c'est notamment à la suite de la lecture de son livre, Cyborg, que les tout premiers membres, les cofondateurs de l'association se sont retrouvés. Sa définition, ce qu'il a d'abord appelé un transhumanisme démocratique, enfin en américain, democratic transhumanism, c'est important de préciser, on y reviendra je pense, et donc c'était avant d'opter ensuite pour techno-progressisme. Eh bien ça a percolé avec une mouvance qui est devenue aujourd'hui dominante dans le transhumanisme francophone. Et depuis 15 ans maintenant, nous avons eu régulièrement l'occasion de vérifier que ces analyses, elles correspondent beaucoup, me semble-t-il, aux attentes des membres de cette association, de leur majorité en tout cas. Et encore ce mois de juin, pas plus tard, voilà que début juin, lors d'un colloque auquel nous avons participé ensemble à Marrakech, au Maroc, voilà, on a eu l'occasion de se rendre compte de cette proximité. Au passage, je signale que vous pouvez retrouver toutes les vidéos de ce colloque à Marrakech en ligne sur YouTube. Et donc voilà, c'est un plaisir de recevoir James Hughes. Ensemble, nous allons essayer d'approfondir pour mieux comprendre qu'est-ce que c'est que ce techno-progressisme qu'il incarne, je crois, mieux que quiconque.
Cet épisode sera en anglais, donc je vous invite à aller sur la version YouTube de l'épisode pour trouver les sous-titres en français. Sans plus attendre, voici le podcast. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to talk to you, and I'd like to know first, what is your definition of transhumanism? Because it's a term that a lot of people use, and a lot of people have different definitions. So what is your definition of transhumanism?
Well, I've been recently emphasizing the aspect of the problem of defining transhumanism about whether it has normative content or not, or how much normative content. So, in other words, if you think that transhumanism is simply the idea that we're transitioning away from being human and whoopee, without a normative direction to it, then I call that transhumanism. That means you're just excited about the fact that we're in the transhuman condition. And there are some people like that. And there are some people who believe that we're in the transhuman condition and are completely opposed to it. So you could be a transhumanist. You could believe that we're currently transhumans and not like it, right? Now, if you, on the other hand, if you, like Julian Huxley, think that there was this thing or a set of things called humanism, and that because we are now technologically pushing the limits of what people will consider human, although I think that's problematic too, because I think that all of these definitions, when we humans started and when we end, are just made up. But at any rate, if you think, as Julian Huxley did, that we need to come up with some new humanism to explain and defend the values of the moment, then the trans part of that is it has to cover the past and the future that we're going to enter, right? We needed a humanism for our times. So what he was getting at was specifically about defending various kinds of values and perpetuating them and figuring out what they mean in a new future. So for me, transhumanism is both of those things, and I am more interested in the normative in trying to figure out what the direction is that we should go in the future. Another way to look at this is that transhumanism is ancient aspirations to have more wisdom, more life, more intelligence, to be more than we are, that we've seen throughout history in myths and stories and magical practices and so forth. And then 300-400 years ago, the Enlightenment, the French Enlightenment, the Scottish Enlightenment, Russian Enlightenment, came along and said, look, you don't need to rely on magic, or you could have a little magic, but you should mainly rely on science and technology. And science and technology will get you these things, will allow you to be smarter and healthier and all of this. And that strain of Enlightenment thought then was connected to political ideas. It was connected to the idea of radical individual liberty, that we should control our own bodies, our own brains, our own reproduction. It was connected to the idea of democratic legitimacy for government. And it was connected to egalitarianism, that we should have, that we should be critical of inequality and attempt to create equality. So to the extent that these other political ideas were still attached to this techno-optimistic idea that technology was going to produce all these wonderful things about the future, that's what I call techno-progressivism. But also it's, depending on which pieces are connected, it's also transhumanism. So the transhumanism at its core is that techno-optimism, Enlightenment techno-optimism. And then if you attach these value elements, we want more equality, we want more freedom, then it becomes a more fully fleshed normative project. And that's the transhumanism part that I've been more interested in. I mean, I think it is descriptively true that we are transhumans, but that's not enough, doesn't tell you enough about what we need to do.
And as a sociologist, what can you say about this movement and its impact on society today, and also in shaping the way we see the future?
Well, of course, like many intellectuals, I am fascinated by examples of intellectuals who had no audience in their time, but had an enormous impact on history. Marx and Engels wrote the manifesto while the revolutions of 1848 were raging, and they had absolutely nothing to do with them. But 100 years later, people remember the Communist Manifesto. So that's, of course, the template for the intellectual who gets it right, even though no one knows it at the time. So I'm not quite sure how much influence transhumanists have. I mean, if we look back at our forebears, there's some that were geniuses that had an enormous impact on things. Condorcet, the Marquis de Condorcet. I think he's a totally legitimate candidate for a proto-transhumanist, and was a part of the French Revolution, and of course had an enormous impact through that. J.B.S. Haldane in England, one of the founders of evolutionary biology, genius, had enormous political and scientific impact throughout his life. So as individuals, transhumanists or proto-transhumanists have had a lot of influence. The development of a movement of transhumanism, or a subculture of transhumanism, in the 1990s, basically. Well, I think you can say that FM 2030's circle in New York in the 1970s was a transhumanist subculture. There are, a couple hundred people involved in that. And then in California, when the extropians get organized in California back in the late 80s and early 90s, and they start having conferences and pool parties, and they start getting it going. And that's when I first encountered the whole thing, because the internet was developing, and they had a very popular internet email list. To what extent have these people had an influence? Well, they influenced people and provided an ideological framework for people who have had an enormous influence. So an example of that would be Peter Thiel, who was one of the founders of PayPal and Facebook and so forth. An enormous billionaire who is one of the leading supporters of proto-fascist politics in the United States. And one of the influences there was the kind of the dark side of transhumanism is that if you want to say, oh, don't pay attention to climate change and inequality and racism and authoritarianism, what you really need to pay attention to is how wonderful the future is going to be once we get rid of all the obstacles. And because the future is going to be so wonderful, anything that gets in the way of that wonderful future has to be swept aside. It's a moral imperative for us to sweep aside democracy or any political movement that might slow down the pace of innovation. So in that regard, I think the transhumanists who were a part of Peter Thiel's circle, the neo-reactionaries, have had enormous impact. Now, I think another way to look at it, though, is that transhumanism as a liberatory impulse about how we might approach technology. So, I constantly tell people, look, you may like the Luddites, the idea of the Luddites, smashing machines. But what did Marx say about the Luddites? Because most of these people I argue with consider themselves socialists. So what did Marx say about the Luddites? He said, don't smash the machine. Take over the machine, right? It's not about just saying, oh, machine's bad. No, it's controlling the machine. So for those of us who approach the transhumanist or these questions of technopolitics from that perspective, we're constantly looking, it's like, okay, I want a longer life. I just want everybody to have a longer life. I want to be freed from work. I just want everyone to benefit from being freed from work and not just the rich, right? So on the one hand, you have the transhumanism as magic pixie dust that you spread on top of neo-authoritarianism. And on the other hand, you have it as a part of truly liberatory movements. And that's for me the core of why I keep pushing this term and this idea and this intellectual history of techno-progressivism, because I think it's absolutely essential that we have the sexy, high-tech vision of the future to offer to people, right? Because the left is dead. The social democratic left has been destroyed principally by the disconnect between the techno and cosmopolitan optimism of college-educated people, European, young people who have college educations, who want Europe, who want a free Europe with gay rights and transgender rights and all this kind of stuff, and the primarily blue-collar folks who are like, well, wait a minute, that's not the politics we signed up for. So this central question of how we construct an attractive version of the future that can speak to all the different parts of our populations, and not just the affluent, college-educated people who are pretty sure that they're going to benefit from whatever that future is going to look like, and they might be wrong about that too. But I think this is the central political question. So for me, transhumanism and transhumanist politics have had an enormous influence, just not with the term transhumanism yet.
As you say, several of the transhumanists at the origin of the contemporary movement, such as Feridun Asfandiari, you're also talking about SFS 2030, and you was talking about Extropian. I think about Natasha Vita-Moore, who is still today the director of Humanity Plus. They was talking about transhumanism. They consider it, they say that it should be upwing. That was their word, isn't it? Does transhumanism has to be upwing?
The person who came up with this term, so far as I know, is FM 2030, as you say. And if you look back at what he, in his book, Upwingers, when he was describing what it means to be upwing, he was writing in the 1970s, early 1970s. And the new social movements, feminism, gay rights, they had just really come into their new existence at that time and not been incorporated. There hadn't been the kind of new left-wing synthesis of politics that incorporated the new social movements with Marxism. So when he was saying left-right, he was partly talking about the 20th century Cold War political framework. And there were certain topics that he thought if you were a truly upwing transhuman, that you would gravitate towards. So a freedom about sex, gender was part of his vision. He certainly advocated that. And now, of course, we would see that's not upwing, that's left wing. If you think everyone should have sexual freedom and be able to change their bodies and be a butterfly if they want, that's more of a left wing thing. Some of the things that he talked about, I don't think ever became true. Were at the time perhaps not considered clearly partisan, but now are. Now, I'm not an essentialist about politics. I think it's possible to imagine politics and to find examples of historical politics that combine anything, right? You can find monarchist, what's North Korea if not a Marxist-Leninist monarchy, right? So you can find examples all over the world of weird combinations of things. Whenever someone says that they're upwing today, I pause. I try to think about it, but it's usually the reason that they think that is because they're ignorant, right? They're just ignorant of the political and ideological intellectual history of the idea that they're talking about. So if you say, I'm for universal basic income, therefore I'm upwing. Okay, well, yes, universal basic income is a policy that has had left-wing supporters and right-wing supporters, but there is a left-wing universal basic income and a right-wing universal basic income. So which are you for? Are you for a generous universal basic income that would require progressive taxation, if not outright expropriation of capitalists? Or are you for a minimal universal basic income that allows capitalism to continue to exist just fine and exploit everyone at a new higher level? That's the right and the left. If you have never thought about that, you're just ignorant. You're not upwing, you're just ignorant. Now, if you want to propose something like, we should all be ruled by the three-breasted Queen of Mars, yeah, that's not a left-wing or a right-wing idea. That's truly upwing. And so there are people like the singularitarians who think that we're soon going to be on the cusp of either being destroyed and eaten by our robot god or ruled by our robot god. That I don't think that's necessarily left or right wing. I know it's not left wing because the left hopefully would say we want human accountability for our system.
It's almost like a landscape, transhumanism. So I think especially in France, transhumanism, people associate this idea with tech billionaires, techno-utopians in the Silicon Valley, or libertarians, like you mentioned, Peter Thiel. But yeah, it's a very small, maybe not that small, but it's actually not the whole picture. So, and we also heard about the techno-progressism. So can you walk us through the different flavors of transhumanism? Is there only right or left? And what kind of, is there a weird combination?
Well, first, it is interesting from the French perspective because Macron, is clearly trying to be upwing. He's neither left nor right. He's, going beyond the five-star movement in Italy, an example of another attempt to transcend ordinary politics, the pirate parties. So there are certainly extant political movements, but I'm sure, as you know, from France, people don't consider Macron beyond left and right. They just consider him an incoherent and very frustrating mishmash of left and right. But I think, if you understand politics as having at least two dimensions, the cultural dimension and the economic dimension, I think you can understand a lot of what is going on. And as I said, I'm very by the way, I'll get back to your original question, but I'm very taken with Piketty, Thomas Piketty's analysis of the crisis of the left, because if you have an economic dimension and a cultural dimension of politics, and social democrats are the ones who have redistributive views and liberal cultural views, and the traditional conservatives have the non-redistributive or capitalist views or whatever, and the culturally traditional views. you have these other two corners, the libertarians and the populists. And my analysis has always been that the blue collars are primarily in the populist corner. That's their natural political inclination. They want more equality because they're not affluent, but they don't have exposure to education, and so they're more religious and more nationalistic and so forth. So their natural inclination is this populist corner. And educated, affluent people, their natural inclination is the libertarian corner. But because the politics is like this, the Social Democrats are trying to get some working class people on the basis of economics and some educated people on the basis of culture, and the conservatives the opposite. And so these coalitions are very unstable depending on exactly where you position the dots in that framework. So at any rate, you would expect that that even though the bulk of blue collar people are more sympathetic with a populist political message, that if you get really, really tiny, if you get like Zemmour, that you're not going to be speaking to very many people. At any rate, I think this is one of the central dilemmas, and it relates to the transhumanist problem because, as I said, if you look at attitudes towards technology, artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, brain implants, to the extent that we've been doing survey research on this, there are two big correlates of people's attitudes in the industrialized world towards these technologies: religion and education. And religion is actually a product of education, right? So the more education you have, the more secular you become. So education is driving both the political, the kind of material division of our society into people who can work from home and have a low unemployment rate and so forth, and those who can't. It's also driving this cultural division of our society along these cosmopolitan Enlightenment, anti-Enlightenment lines. And one of the things that's caught up in that is our attitudes about technology. So I think to the extent that the transhumanist project has a kind of natural political coloration, it's to side with this the Brahmin left or the college-educated populations. And I don't think the Greens realize that yet. The Social Democrats don't realize that yet. I haven't seen any ultra-left parties realize that yet. I wish Mélenchon would realize that. But as it comes down to things like transgender rights, it's been a joke for a long time that transhumanism has, why don't you change your name because you sound like transgender? It's like, so what? There's a very close relationship between what we're talking about here. On the one hand, that you have a right to be anything you want to be, and on the other hand, you have a right to be anything you want to be. So we're both, involved in that. And to the extent that this transgender issue has become such a central fight, through, from Moscow to California, it is emblematic of the kind of technopolitics that we're going to be entering into, right? So another dimension here, I've been writing recently about the artificial womb and its effect on the abortion debate. Now, if you think that artificial wombs are just bad for women, I understand. The right would like artificial wombs so that they could if someone gets pregnant and doesn't want to keep their baby, they want to take the embryo and put it in the artificial womb. It's called fetal rescue. But on the other hand, the artificial womb would completely upend the gender binary reproductive system, right? Anybody, you could have two men put together their genomes and put it in an artificial womb. No women have to be involved at any point. This is when you go back to the Huxleys, because JBS proposed artificial wombs back in 1923, and then he and his circle of crazy people wrote 100 books about the future called Today and Tomorrow, that they published between 1925 and 1935, something like that. And about 20 of those books addressed the idea of the artificial womb and how revolutionary it would be for the society. Some of them hated it. Some of them thought it would be bad for women. Some of them thought it would be bad for men. But they were fascinated by this idea of the artificial womb. So I'm just riffing at this point. Take me back to your original question, Gaetan.
Yeah, I guess my question is was also to try to, and you actually mentioned that there is a little bit of transhumanism in every corner of the political landscape, up and down, left and right. There's also a combination that are kind of weird, which is fundamentalist. I mean, maybe not fundamentalist Christian, but there's Christian transhumanist.
So, well, let's start with the religion question, because yes, the vast majority of transhumanists, people who call themselves transhumanists, are secular, if not atheists. And although you can kind of, you can dig deeper there, because many of the things that they're doing or thinking have a quasi-religious aspect to them, right? If they think, you know, the end of the world's coming in a decade and I have to do all these ascetic practices in order to survive the, you know, the end times, that's not exactly a secular worldview, but at any rate. So the religious transhumanism, I think, is going to be very important. And in fact, when I was hanging out in Tübingen this last week, we were talking about the Vatican. The Vatican has a new project called Humanity 2.0, and they've been in the Pontifical Academy, and they've been pulling together both Catholic and non-Catholic scholars who write about posthumanism, transhumanism. So they seem to have a new and ongoing interest, not like under Ratzinger, who was just like, no, just say no. The Catholics, I think, are going to take some time. There is a Protestant Christian Transhumanist Association in the United States, but the biggest transhumanist religious organization is the Mormons, because the Mormon Transhumanist Association considers transhumanist ideas to be the fulfillment of Mormon prophecy. More or less. They're you know, sometimes they're just atheist Mormon people who grew up in Mormon culture who are atheists who just like talking about the ideas. But anyway, so there's the religious aspect, but most of us are secular. And then within the secular, I would say, you know, some of us are political and some of us are not. And some of the religious are secular, political too. But the ones who are apolitical, there's a couple basic subcultures. There's the longevity subculture, the people who are really concerned about health and medicine and diet and things like that. And that subculture goes back a long time in the United States and Europe. You know, the college I went to was founded in 1830s by perfectionist Christians who were vegetarian. And at the time, there were all these spas that you could go to where they would, you know, give you enemas and sit you in a frozen bath and make you eat, you know, squirrels or whatever, and think that it was for your health. So this culture of longevism is been around for a long time. It's just that today it has a scientific basis and it's connected to the transhumanist thing. There's the culture of artificial intelligence and the kind of cult of rationality of people who think that generally they think that this can never be made as rational as silicon, and therefore we have to start preparing for the advent of the robot god. And so the singularitarians, a lot of them have that kind of flavor, and I call that a messianic subculture of transhumanism. But within the politics of transhumanism, as I've said, the two biggest camps have been the techno-progressives and the libertarians. The libertarians have all the money, of course, you know, being bankrolled by people like Peter Thiel. The techno-progressives are the people on the left who are also transhumanist. You know, it's a very diverse thing, from people who are Marxist-Leninists to people who are, you know, maybe in Macron's cabinet, who knows. But it's, you know, we're all very diverse. My joke is that the Italian transhumanists, there are two factions to the Italian transhumanists. They hated each other because they both said the other was the fascist, which is true. And then in the Russian transhumanists, there were three factions. There's the pro-Putin transhumanists, the anti-Putin liberal transhumanists, and the anarchists who hated them both. So, you know, we're divided all over the world in many different ways. But broadly speaking, there is a left of transhumanism and a libertarian right of transhumanism. Now, the most right-wing aspects of transhumanism are the ones that I was talking about, the neo-reactionaries. people like Yarvin who have argued for monarchy, argued against women's equality, argued against liberal democracy. And those are the people who have been influential on aspects of the alt-right, Trumpism, neo-reaction, Steve Bannon, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, and so you also, well, you're known for the idea of techno-progressism. So you talked a little bit about it already, but can you dig deeper about this idea and what's, because I think you wrote a manifesto or like a set of maybe core principle, core values with Mark as well.
Mark?
Yeah, he was part of it.
Yeah, no, it was a group effort. There were 70 of us who participated in some way. And yeah, I sketched out some of the ideas. But so I've been a manifesto kind of guy since I was a teenager, you know, back when I thought I was going to join the Red Brigades or the Weathermen. And it's like, today we blew up the bank and this is my manifesto, you know. So I've always liked manifestos. And they're a good opportunity to crystallize a central and short, brief message about what you're trying to get at. The book that I had written, Citizen Cyborg, was an argument for what I call democratic transhumanism. So it was basically just saying, what's the relationship between the social democratic project and these transhumanist ideas? So the beginning of working all that out and saying, well, here's some of the kind of core ideological ideas like if you buy the idea that the market is natural and the state is unnatural. And, you know, the kind of evolutionary rationale for Austrian or neoliberal economics, the idea that you shouldn't interfere in something that's evolutionarily optimized as well as a market. You know, a market is so much more intelligent than anything human planners and socialist tinkerers could ever do. If you have that approach to the market, why don't you have that approach to the body? Right? Well, because that's what people are telling us about why we shouldn't screw around with the body, right? Because human beings are too stupid to ever understand the consequences of changing an aspect of the body. So I was just pointing out, it's like, you can't be that kind of anarchist capitalist and also a transhumanist because the two arguments don't work together. So if you believe, like me, that human beings should become more and more intelligent and eventually control more and more about our environment, then the question is, how do we do that? What does it look like at a collective scale? What kind of collective empowerment and political structures do we need to make sure that it's not just a bunch of random individual ping pong balls determining the future, but actually some kind of collective discussion and intelligence. So that was the kind of the vision of what a social democratic approach to this radical futurism might be. The techno-progressive term was actually introduced by a person who was participating in the IET early on, Dale Carrico, and he wrote a number of compelling pieces about why he thought that this was the broader framework of what we were doing. And it appealed to me because transhumanism is specifically for me about the human enhancement question. But techno-progressivism, making it about attitudes towards science and technology more broadly, I think is a useful and important thing to do, because there are questions like geoengineering, genetic engineering of crops, whether terraforming other planets. You know, if you say, oh, Mars in its pristine state must be preserved, you know, yes, for maybe a decade, but then after that, I think we should be able to do whatever we want with it, you know, make sure that there's nothing living there, and then we'll just do it. But those are philosophically similar questions to the kind of questions that people pose about human enhancement. So I think pushing it up to the technology level as opposed to just human enhancement is important. Then the progressive, of course, progressive, at least in American discourse, liberal fell out of fashion, you know, 30, 40 years ago as a term, and progressive just got more and more popular as a self-descriptor. So putting those two together, and it also shows the balance in what we're trying to do, people like Mark and myself, in saying, look, we want a certain kind of future, and the best kind of future that we could have would be one that maximizes technology in these ways and maximizes equality and personal empowerment and liberal rights in these other ways. So there's a political dimension to improving the future and a technological one. If you take away one, we probably still want the other, but they're best together, right? And sometimes if they're not together, it's going to be disastrous, right? If you have a perfectly egalitarian society that impoverishes itself by banning all technology and not pursuing innovation, it's just going to be eaten by its neighbor who did, in fact, invent the super soldiers and the giant tanks. And if you have a perfectly technological society, but only the 1% have access to all those goods, I'm glad we invented those technologies, but that's not as good as having everybody have access to those goods. So it's about the balance of those two and their mutual reinforcement. And I think that's where a lot of people don't understand what we're trying to do, because it's not just about being techno-optimist or saying that all technologies would be good. And even if we do, people sometimes say, we can't do that until we get rid of capitalism. And I'm like, okay, look, it doesn't work that way, right? Where, it's like, yes, we're going to have more drug abuse until we get rid of capitalism. But in the meantime, having safer drugs might save a lot of people's lives. And when we get rid of capitalism, yes, maybe fewer people will want to take those drugs, but let's work on both having safer drugs and getting rid of capitalism. We can do both at the same time. And that's the basic idea, I think, of techno-progressive.
James, I will bring you a little back to speak about some maybe much more internal political aspects of transhumanism. Because when you were yourself director of Humanity Plus, and I recall that it was under your leadership that the World Transhumanist Association changed its name, you commissioned several internal polls which show that the members who were techno-progressives were about, if I remember well, about 40%, while those who were closer to the libertarian tendency were about something like 20%, I think. What is your feeling on the political evolution of the international transhumanist movement over the last 10 years? And maybe for the years to come?
I'm not quite sure. I think that because of the loose boundaries around these things, it's like let me go back to socialist political history. The U.S. Socialist Party was always relatively small at its peak. It had, I don't know, a million people who voted for president and 100,000 members, I think. But the ideas in the Socialist Party got absorbed quickly into the progressive movement in the Democratic Party, right? So, and a lot of the individuals who were involved in the Socialist Party joined the Roosevelt New Deal and the anti-fascist politics and so forth. So I think one of the questions about our influence, Ray Kurzweil doesn't call himself a transhumanist. Ray Kurzweil is obviously hugely influential, and almost everyone considers him a transhumanist. He doesn't call himself a transhumanist. So there are people like that, and the Singularity University was trying to do that as well. They were trying to say, okay, come to our ideological boot camp. We'll fill your head with transhumanist ideas. You don't even have to call it transhumanism after this, and you don't have to be an advocate or an evangelist for a movement. All you have to do is go out and be rich. Go out and make as much money as you possibly can. And so is that the influence or ideology of transhumanism? Anyway, there are very few ideological, self-described transhumanist organizations left in the world. Yours being an exception, thank God. But those that are, a lot of them went through after 2014 when we met in Paris and issued the Techno-progressive Declaration. We were, I think, cognizant at the time that there was a political a need to be more clear about the political directions that we were taking, and a lot of interest in engaging politically at the time. So various parties got organized, the Transhumanist Party in the UK, the Transhumanist Party in the US. The Transhumanist Party in the US is mostly libertarian. Zoltan Istvan was not a deep thinker, but he was, most of the things that he said were libertarian, and then the party that came out of what he did is mostly libertarian. But David Wood in London and the people involved in the UK Transhumanist Party were mostly from our set, the techno-progressives, again, not interested in, articulating the relationship between Karl Kautsky and techno-progressivism the way I am, but at least broadly liberal left people. So there have been a variety of attempts, and some of them are on the right and some of them on the left. But I would say that the collapse of the vision was reactionary in itself, the collapse of the vision of what we were trying to do back at the 2000s. I was coming out of 25 years of being a social democratic activist. I'd been a delegate to the Socialist International. I had built the first website for the Socialist International. I wrote the WTA Constitution based on the Constitution of the Socialist International. I've really envisioned the World Transhumanist Association as an ideological version of the Socialist International. So, so we put a lot of energy into organizing chapters and having a formal and democratic articulation of all of these different people around the world. When the Silicon Valley people took over in 2008, 2009, and turned it into Humanity Plus, they weren't interested in any of that. They were interested in seasteading, Peter Thiel's project of building little island nations. They were interested in, there was a proposal that we start a high school clubs called the Mad Scientist Club. And I'm like, what? Encouraging irresponsible use of technology? That's what you think the whole project is? At any rate, there was a strong turn to the right. And that was also the period in which Jeffrey Epstein was funneling money to Humanity Plus fortunately after all of us left. And that was the period in which Peter Thiel was the principal backer of all of those projects. So they knew that, at Jeffrey Epstein, his crimes no one was aware of yet, but Peter Thiel had been a reactionary since he was in college. And everyone knew that he was a right-winger. And so if you wanted to get money from Peter Thiel to support, SINS got a lot of money from Peter Thiel. The artificial intelligence people got a lot of money from Peter Thiel. If you want to get that money, you're not going to be go around, slagging off billionaires and calling for redistribution or anything like that. Not that that was on the agenda, but there was an ideological constraint placed on their political imagination, and they knew it. And the fights that we were having internally was a part of that also. The libertarians and the extropians were briefly demobilized when Extropy Institute closed. But then they all started to fight like hell within the WTA, specifically against me, because I was on the left. But I had been very clear that I thought that this project was one where if we all acknowledged our differences, that we could very consciously have a popular front, organization against the bioconservatives. That it's like, yes, you want to smash the state and replace it with markets, and I don't. But we both agree that transgender people should have rights. So let's work on that. And that was the kind of coalition I wanted us to have. But they were not politically, I think it was political sophistication, really, but there was also personality stuff. There were a lot of different kinds of personalities. So at any rate, I got out around 2008, 2009. And after that, I think, it tilted pretty considerably to the right. There were still people in there who I would think are not right-wingers, like Ben Goertzel has been a kind of lefty for a long time. If you whenever you press Natasha, she'll point out that she ran for office as a Green, which is true. Although if you ask her about any Green politics, she doesn't have very much to say. But at any rate, I think the thing tilted considerably to the right. Now, and as you say, the surveys that we did had shown that that was a tragedy because the neoliberal right or the anarcho-capitalists, they only represented about 20-25% of the world transhumanist population, and the bulk of us were on the left. So you're leaving a lot on the table if you're going to take that political line. If you track who talks about transhumanism, there has been an uptick under COVID in the discussion of transhumanism in the popular press. It's not from us, it's from the right. The QAnon conspiracy theory right, the Christian conspiracy theory right, they're fascinated by transhumanism. And it only takes one Jeffrey Epstein, a guy who's supporting transhumanist projects and runs a pedophile rape island and is friends with people like Peter Thiel and Bill Clinton. It only takes one, but that was enough to indelibly connect the transhumanist project to every conspiracy theory that has ever existed, right? That we want to control global population, murder billions of people, have eugenics, racist Rothschild bankers, whatever we are. And those are the people who are talking about transhumanism now. So I think there's a reason why, if we're going to have progress with transhumanism, we need to come up with new terms. That's one of the reasons I support using this term techno-progressivism. It's politically more specific, and it also is not the term transhumanism.
Anyway, even if, after the trial we had in 2014 with the Techno-progressive declaration, and even our meeting in Brussels in 2017, where we tried to deepen this work, it happens that maybe this hope have been dashed. I don't know. But do you think it's possible to give a new impetus to this kind of initiative? Or do you think that it's more clever to try to go somewhere else?
Whenever I argue against the idea of explicitly transhumanist or even explicitly techno-progressive political party, for instance, the American left wasted 100 years trying to organize third parties. And finally, Bernie has more or less convinced American leftists that the road to progress is not by organizing a workers' party, a pure workers' party, but going through the Democratic Party, the existing political institutions. So if I was in France, I would not be advocating for organizing a transhumanist party, but I would try and see where within the Mélenchon coalition, the NUP coalition, and where within the Macron's grouping there might be people who could be talked to, which are the think tanks, which are the magazines and newspapers and journalists who need to be cultivated, who are sympathetic to these ideas. And you start building a network that probably won't be explicitly NUP, and it won't be hopefully not exclusively Macron, but that will be something along those lines that would connect all the people. So a lobby, being a lobby, a social movement, and just on the same model as environmentalists had to do, feminists had to do, and so on, and the labor movement had to do. So that's what I've been advocating for. Now, are we in a stable political global situation? Are things changing very, very rapidly? Are all our assumptions about what works politically and doesn't work politically questionable? Yeah, who knows what's going to happen? Europe's on fire. We just went through a global pandemic. We have a world war. It's like all kinds of things could happen, and there's been declining trust in every industrialized country in the organized political party form. And yeah, probably people are looking for new answers. Are they looking for new answers from a bunch of white guys who want to, genetically engineer their children? Probably not. And so, if we really want to have a political influence, I think we have to figure out how we fit in the existing, flow of political change. We're clearly opposed to far-right Christian fascist nationalism, right? That none of us, except for a very few of us, and fuck those guys, but none of us want to support that kind of politics. So we're on the other side, but there are a lot of people on the other side. And that was why we wrote the Techno-progressive Declaration. It's like, look, we need to find our home and start building these connections. Here's what we need to talk to the feminists about. The feminists, for the most part, are very suspicious of these technological projects. Gender is a big driver of these attitudes about techno-optimism and techno-pessimism. And so there's a lot of barriers there. But if you're principally concerned about securing women's rights to use technology to control their own bodies, then we have something to talk about, right? Because we agree with that. If you want to talk to disability folks, they're very suspicious. Disability folks come after us with pitchforks because they think we want to put them all in gas chambers, and we don't. And what we need to talk to them about is, first, most disabled folks don't want to have disabilities. You know, most disabled folks, if you told them, hey, we have a social policy that would eliminate your disability from society, they'll go, sounds like a good idea. You go right ahead with that. We don't think any more blindness needs to happen in this society. Being blind sucks. If you go to a blind intellectual and you say, hey, we've got this thing that's going to cure blindness, they say, oh, that's just like the Nazis. You know, it's like, no, it's not just like the Nazis. But so we have an agenda. We have things we need to talk to disabled folks about. We think the labor movement, about automation. We have, the intellectual rights of intellectual property debates are something that we have to intervene on. So this is the political work, but you don't do that. And this is where, again, I'm influenced by my socialist past. I was a socialist for decades at a time where the only thing that a politician wanted from you was work, and never to say that you were a socialist, right? You go to the average Democratic politician in the 1980s who was sympathetic, maybe they represented a black district or something, and you say, me and my socialist buddies, we'd like to help you. And say, well, in the first place, never say that you're a socialist, because that will not help me at all. But if you want to do some work for me, that's fine. And I think we're in the situation currently where you need to internally understand that you're engaged in a political project and that you're part of a network that's engaged in a political project. But whether it helps to ever say publicly, oh, the reason we're supporting this this pro-abortion policy is because we're transhumanists, and this pro-abortion policy is endorsed by transhumanism. I don't think we're at the point where that's going to help. Probably that's going to hurt. But if we could get more people in the futurist, techno-progressive, transhumanist milieu to understand that there is a project and an identity around that project, and that the people who are working in reproductive rights can do this, and the people who are doing this can do that, that's the kind of situation we're in now. And I think the historical parallel is like the Fabians. Now, the Fabians were pretty out there and public about their work, but the Fabians in the sense that there have been times when the transition from being a salonier, like being a philosophe in 1780s, having dinner parties and talking about curious ideas, and then you get to the late 19th century, and some of those people began to form little utopian socialist communities and communes and study groups and things like that. I think we're at that stage. The futurist ideas we're trying to get into politics will eventually, I think, become mass politics. And we're trying to shape that and influence it in the same way that the Fabians did with the British Labour Party.
There's also something you advocate for. It's called the longevity dividend. Recently,
the left has begun to, some people in the American left, English language left, have noticed that a lot of billionaires are talking about population. Elon Musk is anxious about it. The World Economic Forum, all kinds of people are anxious about the birth dearth. The Chinese Communist Party just realized that they're going to start shrinking as a country and be half the size that they are now by the end of the century. That's going to be a disaster. We look at the social dysfunctions of Japan. Japan's already shrinking, and all of the young people are so depressed that they lock themselves in their rooms and never come out again. We're facing some demographic issues, and we need to adjust rapidly. People in public policy who've been worried about this for the last 50 years as they look at the baby boomers and say, well, if the baby boomers don't have X number of children, then we're going to have this kind of a shape of our population, and that's not going to be so great. So they began to talk about entitlement reform, raising the retirement age. I mean, you've had these fights in France. I think that they're fighting about in Australia. And so the question is, as the life expectancy rises, how does society and our social policies change and adapt? Well, one critical factor, at least at the old age end of it, is that if you are a sick or disabled senior citizen, so if you have Alzheimer's disease or heart disease or cancer or something like that, you're going to cost 4 or 5 times as much to society as if you're not. So if you're just living quietly by yourself as an 80-year-old, you have your friends, you have your children, but you're not sick and disabled. You don't need a daily nurse to come in. You're not in a nursing home. That's one thing, and the state can relatively easily afford that. If you need full-time 24 nursing care and a bunch of expensive medicine, you're way more expensive for society. Now, in public policy, since basically the World War II, it's been difficult to talk about the relative costs of keeping people alive, but it's just a fact, right? That shrinking number of working age adults to provide for the taxes, the fiscal taxes, to pay for a growing number of disabled seniors. So the first idea of the longevity dividend is, what if we could keep those seniors healthy longer, right? To keep them from losing their abilities longer. That would reduce the burden of the welfare state and partly address this old age dependency ratio between the shrinking number of workers and the growing number of seniors. So that's part of the longevity dividend. How do we do that? We're on the cusp of being able to mass produce and provide to everyone as a part of universal health insurance, hopefully, except in the United States because we're a third world country, but everywhere else, provide to everyone through a universal healthcare system therapies that would slow down the aging process. And by slowing down the aging process, keep people from getting Alzheimer's and other dementias, cancer, stroke, heart disease, et cetera, et cetera. So in order to get those therapies, the longevity dividend requires that the European medical research agencies and the US coordinate and allow research into anti-aging. And because it's impossible to do medical research for something that's not a disease, we either have to convince those agencies that anti-aging therapies would be preventive of other diseases, which they would be, almost all diseases of aging, or that aging is a disease in and of itself, which would be a more progressive step, that aging is a disease process and that you can have a therapy aimed at that. Now, in the United States, Food and Drug Administration has permitted one trial to proceed on metformin, the diabetes drug, with the novel characteristic. They didn't say aging is a disease and you can try to cure aging. There's still some clinical complications there. But what they said was you can measure as the outcome a reduction in Alzheimer's, dementias, stroke, cancer, heart disease altogether as indications that this may be slowing down the aging process. If they get less of all that, it's not, and that was important because otherwise clinical trials had to say, we are trying to cure cancer or we are trying to cure Alzheimer's disease, saying, we understand that aging is what's behind all that. So here's what you need to do. So the importance of that example is that we have a practical political and policy agenda today to have the kind of basic science funding. The Biology of Aging program in the U.S. National Institutes of Health is only about $50 million. And we spend trillions, we spend a lot on research on cures for therapies for Alzheimer's, cancer, heart disease, and so on, but very little on the core process of aging itself. So we need to expand those budgets, have more research on those. We need to change the clinical trial pathways and facilitate the idea that you can do this research in the first place. So either have aging as a disease or have some kind of special carve-outs for this kind of project. And then we need to look at things like, how do we speed it up? Because if I were to start giving you an anti-aging drug and then to see whether it kept you alive longer, and especially if it did keep you alive longer, it could take 50 years to get that trial done. So we need something that tests the success of an anti-aging therapy in a shorter period of time, and we call those biomarkers. So hormonal or other chemical signals in the body that are pretty reliably tracked to your biological aging process. And if we can slow those down, then you could have a 5-year trial instead of a 50-year trial. There's a very concrete political and policy agenda around this. And there are people who don't call themselves transhumanists at all, who are working on this agenda. There's the Alliance for Aging Research in Washington, D.C. that is, every biogerontologist supports, and the American Association of Retired People, the largest nonprofit organization in the world, other than the Communist Party of China, is a strong supporter of it. So this is not a marginal agenda. They just don't think about it in terms of the broader project of a longevity dividend. Now, just let me say, at the other end, we also have the issue of how globally we deal with the declining fertility rate. I do not believe that people have to have children, and I'm not a pronatalist in that regard. I'm not a pronatalist in this idea that it's any obligation or part of a moral fulfillment to have children. Although, don't tell my children I said that, because I tell them that they have to have children all the time. I want grandchildren. But, but in terms of you, I don't care if you have children. In general, I do think we have a problem if life sucks so bad that even though people wanted to have children, they say, we can't do it in this world. And I think that describes about half of the decline of fertility, especially since COVID. The fertility rate crashing in China, all throughout Europe, all throughout the world, the fertility rate has crashed. And so I think we do have a moral obligation to make life as easy as possible for those who would like to have children, and to improve the lives of those children as much as possible. Because if you're going to produce fewer of something, at least make it higher quality, right? The whole project here, we went from agricultural labor, where it's like, pop out 25 kids, only half of them will survive and the rest will work in the fields, and it doesn't make any difference how smart they are. We went from that to, well, you're not allowed to do that anymore. You have to send them to school and spend $500,000 to raise them. It's like, oh, really? If I'm going to do that, I would like them to be really smart. I would like them to play violin by the age of 4 and go to Harvard if I'm going to spend $500,000 in most of my life on this project. So we're already moving in that direction with children. But our policies, at least in neoliberal countries like the United States, our policies don't reflect it, right? We have a lot of child poverty. Our primary educational system sucks. So we have a lot of work to do at that end to make life better for parents and for children if we want the kind of future that we want. And so I think we have things to say at both ends of the life spectrum, and that could be critical to rebalancing the welfare state in the 21st century.
But one of the objections that as techno-progressives we can heard, I think quite often, is that, we are something like dwarves, and the real transhumanism is really much more in the hands of the digital giant of in California and elsewhere, not only in the US, somewhere in China or somewhere else. These actors give a very strong direction to the evolution that our use of human enhancement techniques may follow. So the question is, how influential can techno-progressivism really be, and how can it make itself heard, because maybe, okay, well, all that are very good ideas, but it stay at a very low level. You will explain how F.S. Esfandiari had an influence on somebody like Peter Thiel. Today we have Elon Musk, I don't know. to what extent and how can techno-progressivism can really influence our societies to counterbalance the individualistic trend? Is lobbying is enough?
Well, there's two ways to approach that question. First is, will there ever be, and is it a project that we should work on, to have an explicit, like a fourth international of techno-progressivism? And, we acknowledge that these are the French techno-progressives, and these are the Germans, and these are the Russians, and only our solid comrades who have the ideological purity should be recognized. No, I don't think it's going to be like that. The opposite end is to say techno-progressivism is this vague thing that we've seen throughout history that encompasses all different kinds of people like Condorcet and Haldane. And we're going to say these are the 10 things that are happening in the world right now that we think are techno-progressive. So, and you can see this within left politics as well. It's like, well, yes, the working class is not self-consciously revolutionary, but this particular union and this particular campaign, these are the things that we think represent the cutting edge of the workers' movement right now, and therefore should be supported. I think that we can do easily. We can say the Universal Basic Income campaign, efforts to expand anti-aging, medicine research and access, all these things are the things that we support, and we can call them a techno-progressive agenda. Now, how do we connect the people who want to be techno-progressives, or is there a reason to organize people consciously as techno-progressives to support these things? I think it's an important question to pause with, because, as I said, with my experience with the American left, sometimes it doesn't help at all, right? If a transhumanist were to, as I gave you an example already, a transhumanist saying, I as a transhumanist support abortion rights. Yeah, that's what the right says already. They say that abortion rights is a part of a transhumanist agenda to murder babies, and you just help them by, feeding into that. So maybe not organizing self-consciously as a transhumanist. But that doesn't give us anything to do then, right? And I do think we have something to do. First, I think we need to make clear that we're not connected to the parts of this that we don't like. And that's why techno-progressivism is superior to transhumanism as far as I'm concerned. But secondly, there are a set of ideological and political questions that you only really understand if you see the totality of these things as connected, right? That if you, for instance, don't see artificial wombs as just a novel idea. No, artificial wombs has a very old history and politics to it that is connected with women's empowerment in many complicated ways. And it's the techno-progressives who understand that at an intuitive level and understand that the questions around that are connected to the disability rights and connected to space travel and connected to artificial intelligence in all these different complicated ways, political and ideological ways. So I do think we have that role. Now, is that enough for us to say, come join our techno-progressive project and ideological study group? Mostly we have been the kind of spillover, the left-wing spillover of transhumanism. And transhumanism has had that juice. But I don't think both for the reasons, the kind of contemporary toxic nature of transhumanism, but also transhumanism just isn't enough. It's like the example, I think, I gave it to George recently. Transhumanism is like a movement organized in 1900 that it says, we want to travel fast. It's okay. Do you want trains or automobiles or planes? Because these are all possibilities. It's like, no, we just want to move fast. It's like, okay, well, do you want seat belts, electric cars, or gasoline cars? No, fast. We want fast. It's like, that's not enough. You need to tell us a little bit more about the kind of future that you want. And that's where we're at with transhumanism. It's like, transhumanists want to travel fast. Great. Do you want regulation of clinical medicine, or do you want this all to be done illegally on offshore experimental Dr. Moreau Islands? Do you want Elon Musk to control the world along with some artificial intelligence robot god, or do you think that the rest of us should have some say? These are important questions, and if just being a transhumanist doesn't answer any of them, really. And you could be depending on where you land, you could be the worst enemy of the other transhumanists. So just being a transhumanist doesn't tell you anything. So I think that for that reason, even though transhumanism has had more of the juice of movement, I think we need to go in different directions.
James, I think that's we are reaching towards the end of our conversation, but I have a last question, which is maybe a little much more personal question, if I can permit myself. We know that with the election of Donald Trump in the United States, you chose to step back from your involvement in transhumanism to focus much more on political action. And since the return of much more democratic or really democratic government, you've returned to transhumanism, but the threat still looms. So how do you see your involvement in transhumanism in the times to come?
The three things in my brain that I have been cycling through and building connections to throughout my life are politics, Buddhism, and futurism. And Cyborg, the moral enhancement, Cyborg Buddha project, that's about that, the futurism and the Buddhism part, et cetera, et cetera. And I felt that when Trump got elected, in the context of Brexit and Erdogan and Putin and Xi, everything else that was happening in the world, I felt and still feel that there was a global rise of neo-authoritarianism and a democratic recession, that the democratic governments were under threat in some global way that I didn't understand and didn't expect, and that I really needed to focus on that, and that that's where this anxiety about transhumanism and futurism being a distraction that is sold to us to distract us from how terrible the present is turning out to be. That's what I began to worry a lot about. Now, I was told pretty quickly by friends that they did not see it that way, that they thought that one of the reasons that we had ended up in the situation that we're in is that the left did not have a compelling vision of the future, and that the project, the work that we do, could contribute to that. And I still think that that's true. But the organization that I had joined in college, the Democratic Socialists of America, had always been about 5,000, 6,000 people. So smaller than, the Socialist Party chapter in Lyon today, not to mention, but when Trump got elected, and then Bernie ran, a whole bunch of people joined. And the average age of our organization dropped from 61 years. Again, I do the surveys for them as well. They dropped from an average age of 61 to an average age of 30. And so the millennial left took over, and they made a bunch of changes. I was a strong Europhile and a strong socialist supporter of the Socialist International, even though, it's never been what I wanted, but it's still the idea of the Socialist International. So we withdrew from the Socialist International. We endorse the BDS campaign against Israel, which we had not done before. We took on the abolish police and abolish prisons idea, which, believe me, the older Social Democrats had never thought about abolishing the police, or much less wanted to talk about it. So there were a whole bunch of political changes. And for me, the political, a key moment in American political history was when the Students for Democratic Society, the American Socialist Party in 1959, 1958, they had an educational wing, the League for Industrial Democracy. And they were getting college students to join in the late 50s, early 60s. They were getting college students to join this thing and trying to rebuild a democratic socialist politics. They turned into the Students for a Democratic Society, and they had a founding convention in 61 at Port Huron, where they were writing their foundation statement. And Michael Harrington, who was the most famous socialist at the time in the United States, member of the Socialist Party, he was sent to observe. And they started to debate the communist question, and the young socialists at this meeting were not sufficiently anti-communist for the Socialist Party folks. And they had actually invited a member of the Communist Party to attend the meeting. And so Michael Harrington freaked out, and he wrote back, called the Socialist Party office, and told them they've gone communist. And they changed the locks on their offices in New York. So when they got back from Michigan to New York, they were locked out of their offices. And that was the kind of foundational split between the new left of the 60s and the old left. And by the end of the 60s, the new left had fractured into Maoists and terrorists and all kinds of stuff, principally because they didn't have enough anti-communism, right? I mean, I have always been an anti-communist. The communist experience set back socialism for 100 years. Lenin was not even a true Marxist. He made it all up. Russia was not supposed to be the whole thing. I am an anti-communist. If the socialists and social democrats had been able to educate and connect with and stay in touch with these young people, we might have had a different story of the 60s. You know, we would not have perhaps had SDS fly off into a billion pieces and literally blow themselves up in certain times. And so when I confronted the fact that after 2016, that the American left was growing exponentially, there was a chapter in my rural town that I never expected there to be. But it was full of these young people who had revisionist views about the Soviet Union, about China, about all kinds of things that I found very problematic. I said to myself, look, we're in the same situation that Michael Harrington was. We can either get really mad and say, you guys don't know anything about the 20th century. What about gulags? 50 million dead, blah, 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 blah. Or we can say, okay, let's work through this. We agree about so much. Your views on foreign policy and 20th century history, perhaps we have to set aside for a moment. That worked for me for a while. I engaged in political education. I was open with people about the fact that I was not a Leninist, did not appreciate the Marxist-Leninist legacy. But it didn't work after February 24th, 2022, because the position that Russia was in the right and that the United States is always and forever and NATO is always in the wrong, refusing to acknowledge that there is any parallel between the current situation and the Third Reich and the expansionism of the Third Reich, or any legitimate situation in which American power could be used on the side of democracy. The refusal to acknowledge any of that, and we're still fighting about this, was so troubling to me that drew me out politically. And it's hard. It's a hard situation. It's the Popular Front situation. It's like, okay, the Nazis are coming, and we're arguing about this, but they don't give a shit. They're going to put us all in prison. So should I set aside all my qualms about having, in American left Twitter last week, they were arguing about whether it was okay to criticize North Korea. I'm like, really? You can't bring yourself to criticize North Korea? What is your understanding of socialism if you think North Korea has anything to do with socialism? But, okay, those people are anti-fascists. I wouldn't want them running my local dog pound, but they're anti-fascists. Should I have to work with those people in order to fight these things? Well, it's that we're in that kind of situation, a very demoralized left. Biden, of course, is a complete disaster. The Democratic Party can't accomplish anything because of the structural inadequacies of American democracy. And I don't feel like I have a very solid political home. So that's one of the reasons why I've been spending a lot more time thinking about the future and the politics of the future. I'm also 61. So if I'm going to have an influence on these things, I have to get busy with my thinking and my writing. But I think we're also, I mean, this gets back to the question of how quickly things can change. We're clearly in a situation where we can't make any solid predictions about, well, next year, this kind of an election will happen or that kind. Next year, America may be a dictatorship and the rest of you are going to have to come and rescue us. You're going to have the Atlantic Alliance come and rescue America from fascism. And that's going to be a pretty different world. And in that world, the Democratic Party may not exist in the Republican Party. And it may be that we're back to organizing a techno-progressive political party, and that will be something that will be viable. So we'll have to see. But yeah, that's the reason. Basically, I go through cycles. I got bored with the left and their stupidity, and maybe I'll get bored with the futurists and their stupidity after a couple more years too.
Okay, thank you very, very much, James. I'm just how to say. I'm so waiting to read a little lines about from Cyborg Buddha.
Okay, so here, just let me say one thing about that. I won't excuse how long it's taken. I have written a lot. I've written a book's length of stuff about Cyborg Buddha, but just not the book itself. And one of the excuses is just the complexity of the science, that it's changing so quickly. But another is that after 2016, I think we all need to, I don't in general like the argument that engineers have any moral responsibility for thinking about the things that they do, right? If an engineer is working on artificial intelligence, yeah, you can say, well, that artificial intelligence could be used to guide a nuclear weapon. And does that mean that the engineer shouldn't make it? No. I mean, they're an engineer making artificial intelligence. In our case, making intellectual arguments, being kind of ideological engineer for the project of changing people's fundamental moral and political sensibilities with technology, I think you do have an obligation to think about the political context in which you're doing it, right? And that's why the paper I just gave at Tübingen was about what a social democratic approach to regulating and to thinking about moral enhancement would be. What does it mean to want a liberal moral enhancement regime? What does it mean to want an egalitarian one? What are the technologies that point in the direction of making a new socialist man with moral enhancement, right? Of making someone who is more caring and more open-minded or whatever. So that's the direction things have taken me more recently. And I think that's probably, hopefully, the capstone of the thinking I needed to do to finish Cyborg Buddha. So hopefully I'll finish that soon.
All right. And if people want to know more about your work in general, where can they find you online?
Well, the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies, that's IEET.org. And we have a Twitter feed, Facebook. We publish essays at medium.com, and people are welcome to submit essays to us there if they think they're appropriate. And then we are starting 2 projects this fall. One will be a project on artificial intelligence at work here in Boston at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. And the other is we'll be hiring a postdoc to work on human enhancement ethics at the University of Turin under Steve Umbrello, who's our managing director. And we hope to expand more collaboration with our European comrades like you, Mark. So,
Great. Well, thanks again, James, for your participation.
My pleasure.
Le podcast
Humain demain.